Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome to episode 3 of the Bad Eye Podcast, coming at you grumpy and sleep deprived from Toronto, Ontario. I am, as always, your host, Andrew, purveyor of aggressively unpopular opinions and devoted acolyte of the cult of the one true hummus. For there is no hummus but OG hummus. None of this roasted garlic shit, no fucking beetroot, certainly no chocolate. If I see you putting a roasted red pepper anywhere near my shit, I will lose my fucking mind. Perfection already exists, and it is a beige paste that needs no embellishment. It will accept adornment. We are not opposed to toppings on the hummus. We love a good garnish at the cult of the one true hummus. We worship thrice weekly, different garnishes every time. Once with shawarma, once with awarma, which is a different thing that is not shawarma, it just happens to rhyme, look it up, and the traditional weekend worship with fete. But the paste itself shall remain unadulterated, particularly by new agey white lady bullshit ingredients. Avocado hummus is a crime against humanity, and the region has suffered enough. Let's get into the news for the week. Elon Musk and Donald Trump continue their effective hostile takeover of the American government. There are really too many things that they're doing to fully comprehensively cover in the scope of this episode and still talk about what I actually want to talk about. But just to give a brief overview of the things that I think are the most relevant and troubling and egregious. They appear to be openly defying multiple court orders, with Musk going as far as to publicly call for the individual firing of judges on Twitter, which crazy that actual government officials are being threatened by insanely high stakes Twitter beef. Like, that's where we are right now. I don't even have a joke for that. That is the joke. America is the joke. But the vice president one-upped him by calling it a judicial coup and saying judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power because apparently they do not have irony in Appalachia. And we're just saying whatever the fuck we want now. That is literally the entire point of the judicial branch of the government. But hey, if they successfully defund the Department of Education, even more Americans will fail civics. And in a generation, no one will even remember that that was true. And there won't even be history class in which people might learn that he said that. So, moving on. The halting of payments of programs that rely on federal money is much more serious than people may even want to hear about because of how the US government disperses money. For one, payments are not usually given out in large lump sums. Most of these programs operate effectively hand to mouth and get payments on a daily or weekly basis. This means that even one or two missed payments could result in employees not getting paid and services not being rendered, effective almost immediately. On top of which, the technical infrastructure that the government uses to disperse these funds is very old. Much of it is written in COBOL, which is a programming language from the 1950s. People hear that and they assume that it's because the government is ineffective and technologically illiterate. And listen, while I am generally pro shitting on the American government for being a gerontocracy run by a few CEOs doing like a weekend at Bernie's thing with dozens of Congress people, in this case, it's actually because a system that complex is more secure and effective with as few moving parts as possible. This is a system that executes millions of individual transactions a day and never misses a payment. It is designed for precision, not agility. Most governments use systems designed this way for this purpose. A side effect of that, unfortunately, is that it is not simple to make changes in this system. Even under a court order, setting up these payments again is going to take time, which means there's basically no easy way to unfuck this situation. And I get why people are not talking about this more. Accounting is boring, and COBOL is even more boring. But people are not going to get services that they depend on because Elon Musk's Hitler Youth cover band is holding kangaroo court hearings for government employees like the criminals in The Dark Knight Rises to see who gets to keep their jobs. That should concern you. In further horrifying news, this week the US government started sending the first round of undocumented people rounded up in enforcement raids by ICE to Guantanamo Bay to be held in rooms that formerly housed people accused of terrorism. Now, I want to be clear, extrajudicial detention was wrong the first time. Guantanamo Bay was always a human rights abomination for dozens of reasons. I can't believe this ever needed to be said, but holding anyone, no matter what they're accused of doing, in indefinite detention without human rights or any kind of due process is objectively fucked up. Another thing that no one ever talks about is that it's also land that was just straight up stolen from the Cuban people. America runs this little mini torture colony on land that was just stolen from a sovereign nation, and we all pretend like that's okay. But I do have to say, even accepting the premise that that kind of detention was ever okay for anybody, at least they were pretending the people who were initially held there were accused of very serious crimes. Killing people, planning or executing attacks on American soil, really egregious stuff. Those people still should have gotten a fair trial, which almost none of them did. but at least the pretense was there. The people that they are sending to Guantanamo Bay right now, many of them have not been accused of any crime, and most of the ones that have been accused of very minor nonviolent offenses. When they started this mass deportation campaign, they said they were targeting violent criminals first. Now, let's be clear, that was always bullshit, because let's be real, this has always been about doing racist dragnet operations to harass and round up brown people. And it's insane to me that that ever needed to be pointed out to people. But I honestly lay the blame for that at the feet of the Democratic Party and most of the mainstream American left for just fully ceding ground to the right wing framing of immigrants as some sort of inherent threat to public safety, despite a total lack of any evidence that that's actually a thing. They entertain that as a legitimate idea and refuse to point out that this has always been racially and ideologically motivated. Stephen Miller has never hidden his ideology or how it informs the way he crafts policy, and this is his policy. And it's unforgivable to me that even the American left is so incapable of facing its own demons that everyone just buried their heads in the sand and straight up accepted his obviously fabricated justification for why this was in any way necessary without challenging it at all. Democrats should never have accepted the premise that migrant crime was a real issue because the data is on their side. Immigrants, documented or otherwise, commit crimes at a significantly lower rate than natural born citizens, both per capita and in aggregate. And as soon as they did accept that framing, Democrats had no leg to stand on because the other side's whole thing is punishing brown criminals. They are literally chopping at the bit to do that all the time. They bring it up constantly when it's not even relevant. Nobody is going to want to buy your Pepsi brand racism when they could have good old fashioned American Coke. This is a nation whose national icon, whose favorite original myth is a literal illegal alien. Superman, the red, white, and blue superhero, the whitest his skin, is the quintessential symbol of America in their popular mythology, even though they have another guy whose name is literally Captain America. And not only is he an actual alien, he also definitely does not have a birth certificate. They found him in a fucking field. They don't ask him for his papers one time. There is no issue of that comic book, no terrible DCEU movie, and no episode of any animated series where they raid the Daily Planet and round him up with the Guatemalan doorman because he doesn't have a passport. He literally flies across the border all the time. America loves illegal immigrants, as long as they look like white people from Kansas. Which is why it should be clear to everyone that this is not about quote unquote illegal immigration. It's not even about immigration, it's about demographics. They don't like that there are so many non-white people in America. That's why they're not sweeping Brighton Beach for undocumented Russians right now, despite there being many undocumented people in that community. Not that I am saying they should, I want to make that clear, but they are harassing indigenous people in the Southwest who have been there since before there was an America, and rounding up and harassing Puerto Ricans who, incidentally, are not immigrants for speaking Spanish, because Puerto Ricans don't even immigrate to the continental United States, they fucking move. If you want more evidence that this is plainly ideological and racially motivated, even according to their own standard, even according to the numbers that ICE has released, a tiny fraction of the people they've rounded up so far have been convicted of anything, violent or otherwise. Some of them are documented, and they are still being sent extrajudicially to be held indefinitely for what is, objectively, not a crime. Crossing the border without documentation, quote unquote illegally, is not a crime in the United States of America according to American law. It is a civil violation. There is no criminal penalty for it. Now, look, all legal designations are arbitrary. Governments are empowered to change laws all the time, but they haven't even attempted to do that in this case. Instead, they are ignoring their own laws to punish people in cruel and inhumane ways. They are scapegoating entire communities to distract white Americans from the fact that their country is a shithole, and most of them live a hand-to-mouth existence that would make people in developing countries go, damn, girl, you live like this? They think because they have fucking Netflix and Apple Pay that they're not poor, but they are being placated with treats, and most of them would be bankrupted by a broken leg. This is what fascist regimes do. They divert people's legitimate anger at a state of affairs that is untenable and direct it at vulnerable groups to prevent it from being directed where it belongs and ever addressing any of the material conditions that led to that deprivation in the first place. And the way it is being normalized and the ineffectiveness and the hand-wringing that it is being met with on the part of whatever opposition still exists in America is frankly chilling. Get your shit together, people. This is not a game, and people are going to die. The rest of the world needs you to get off your asses and do something about this because, not to be alarmist, but otherwise, none of us are going to survive this bullshit. And now for some Canadian news, delivered in a calmer, more Canadian way. On our side of the border, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is continuing his federal campaign to become prime minister, with his latest campaign promise being a permanent military base in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. He announced this a few days ago at the time of recording, standing in front of a picturesque tundra backdrop behind a makeshift podium emblazoned with his campaign slogan, Canada First. Because apparently we don't have political consultants in this country? Like, he knows he can change the slogan, right? Like, it was bad before, but it's going to be really hard to present yourself as a sane, common sense conservative that's going to stand up for Canada and not let us get fucking annexed if you can't even come up with your own sound bites. Did he just like get a good deal on a bunch of secondhand merch from Trump and they just slapped a patch that said Canada over the America part? This is a genuinely perplexing political strategy to me. I feel like I'm in France in 1945 and the guy running for president is using the campaign slogan Schmeil Schmittler. They're doing fascist gulags right now. And my man Pierre is like, I already had all the signs made. Like, we're locked in. We cannot possibly change this now. We'd be out hundreds of dollars. But I also want to talk about the policy because why do we need a permanent military base in Nunavut? Who is paying you to do this? Like, is it defense contractors? Is it the people who manufacture long underwear? Look, I'm not an Arctic sovereignty expert. I might be off base here, but I feel like Russia is not going to be rolling tanks across the tundra. They've been trying to invade the neighboring country unsuccessfully for years now. They are relying on North Korean conscripts to wage their colonial war of attrition in Ukraine. There is no fucking way they have the capability to stage an invasion of Canada from the north across the Arctic. The idea that we need a permanent military presence in Nunavut to protect us from invasion seems kind of ridiculous to me, particularly when the only country even remotely insinuating that they might invade is to the south. To say nothing of the impact that putting a military base full of armed settlers in the middle of a majority indigenous community would have on the already fraught relationship we have with the Inuit people. Those resources would be better spent invested in that community to help people afford food, to address the mental health epidemic that they have, to do something to mitigate the effects of climate change that are destroying their traditional ways of life, to do literally anything but put a bunch of white 20-year-olds with guns in their town. I am not an expert on Inuit people, on their culture, or the particular problems that their communities face, but I am all but certain that if you ask them, they would tell you that none of those issues will be addressed by a military base in the middle of their community. Finally, the last bit of the rundown this week will be about Donald Trump calling for America to effectively annex Gaza, which actually happened last week, but this week he confirmed that Palestinians would not be allowed to return to the rebuilt territory after America was done cleaning it up. It's unclear who is meant to live there then. My guess would be Israelis, although I'm sure that Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and Elon Musk would love it if American Jews flocked there en masse, because then they'd be far away from where they live. Trump's idea to exile them to live in Jordan and Egypt has been roundly rejected by the leaders of both countries, and thankfully seems to be an unpopular idea throughout most of the world. As it should be, because this is an open and explicit call for ethnic cleansing. And while that is shocking and unprecedented in terms of the nakedness with which that sentiment is being expressed, I do want to say that the prior administration's tacit, implicit calls for ethnic cleansing were not meaningfully better from the perspective of the people being ethnically cleansed. Every American administration in the last 4 decades has been equally wrong on this issue, and they have varied only in the degrees of barbarism that they are willing to support and endorse. This particular iteration does seem to be meaningfully worse, but tacit endorsement of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian Arabs from all the land that the Israeli government lays claim to has been the de facto American policy for decades now, and I think it's important to call that out. So today I'm going to speak a bit about that conflict. I'm going to give some historical context. I'm going to address some of the more common talking points, and I'm going to talk about why most of the proposed solutions are fundamentally untenable and also incompatible with the values that we as citizens of at least theoretically pluralistic secular democracies claim to hold dear. And why I feel like while historical context can be useful in establishing yourself as a good faith actor who's not just talking about a very serious topic that they have no expertise in and don't understand, and while I think nuance is generally important, I feel like historical context is actually not necessary and doesn't matter when discussing what should and shouldn't be done going forward. And I would ask that before you lose your mind about me saying that, you hear me out and at least allow me to explain why I feel that way. I'm going to do my best to be measured and factual about the way that I discuss this issue. I understand that it is an emotionally charged issue for a lot of people, and I understand why. There are real life considerations here, people's lives and the lives of people's loved ones that are impacted, often in irreparable ways. And I understand why you may not, as someone from one of the affected communities, want to hear the voice of an outsider discuss this issue. And if that is you, I wouldn't hold it against you if you tuned out now. But I am going to try and discuss this with the seriousness and the intellectual rigor that it deserves, treat it with the sensitivity that I would if it were my own community. And I'd ask that you trust that this isn't something that I just don't know anything about and that I'm sounding off on. I do have some education on this issue, but I would also say that at the end of the day, in addition to some historical and contemporary facts, what I'm going to be presenting here is my own opinion, and it should be taken as just that, an opinion. I have no real power, and so if my opinion upsets or offends you, that is your right, but that is not the goal of me making this episode and putting this out into the world. I would ask that you at least engage with my opinion with the seriousness and sensitivity with which I have tried to engage in this discussion. In some ways, this podcast exists because of this conflict, because the genesis of this idea came out of me watching the coverage of what I consider to be a genocide being perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza over the course of the past year and a half almost, and my frustration with the ways in which it was being discussed in Western media. So I do want to be transparent about the fact that I do support the freedom and liberation of the Palestinian people, and that my opinions about what should and shouldn't happen going forward are informed by that belief. I also want to acknowledge that, in a perverse way, it is true that Palestine, and particularly this current genocide in Gaza, occupies this kind of outsized space in our Western media landscape relative to other genocides, both contemporary and historical, which may be galling for you to hear as a Palestinian person, given the very real absence of any action that has come out of all of that discourse. But I want to address it all the same because it is often a thing that I hear from supporters of Israel and of Zionism, that the Jewish state, and only the Jewish state, is being singled out when there are many other conflicts happening throughout the world that are at least equal, if not greater, in the magnitude of suffering, but are not discussed as ardently or as frequently as Palestine is in the Western media. And so I want to acknowledge that they're not entirely wrong about that. The conflict in Sudan right now fits many of the same criteria by which what has happened in Gaza has been labeled a genocide, and it has displaced an even larger number of people. The treatment of the Uyghur people by the Chinese government is also described in similar terms, but neither are discussed as frequently on the BBC, on CNN, or on CBC. Historically, we in the West have talked about Palestine more than we ever talk about Rwanda, about Chechnya, about Bosnia, about the Belgian Congo. And I want to acknowledge that while there are good reasons why that's the case, it is true that that's the case. But I also want to say that in my mind, that's less of an argument for talking about Palestine less than it is for talking about those other genocides more. And if it is indeed true that Israel is being held to a higher standard than other nations are held to, and even if it's true that the reason for that is a kind of broad anti-Semitism that exists in Western culture, then the remedy for that anti-Semitism should not be to lower the standards for Israel and give them license to commit genocide as well, but to hold every other nation to that same standard. So to begin, I want to address some of the more unproductive ways that this discussion is often carried out. One of the most reductive and useless ways that I hear people, both Zionists and what I'll call well-meaning but misguided liberals, discuss this conflict is by invoking the myth that the source of the conflict in Palestine is some sort of ancient enmity between Arabs and Jews. This kind of clash of civilizations narrative that we often hear from people like Jon Stewart. The idea that they just hate each other. They've hated each other for thousands of years, and they'll always be fighting. Like there's some sort of innate Middle Eastern stubbornness that causes these two peoples en masse to just inherently be at odds with each other. Like this conflict can be reduced to a feud between two brothers who run rival falafel stands right next to each other who haven't spoken in 50 years because of an argument about money from 1973 that neither of them even really remember the cause of anymore. And while that is a real Middle Eastern trope that I suspect people from both communities will recognize and can relate to, framing this conflict that way is not only reductive, it's flat out ahistorical. It's reductive because neither community is a monolith. Not Arabs, not even Palestinian Arabs, and certainly not Jewish people. Both of these communities are racially, ethnically, religiously, and politically diverse. There is a broad range of opinions about Palestine, about Israel, about Zionism, and about the conflict itself in different Arab communities throughout the world, and an equally broad one in Jewish communities of the world, both within Israel and in the diaspora. It's ahistorical for a variety of reasons. One of which is that they cannot have been fighting for thousands of years because Arab identity hasn't existed for thousands of years. And in the Levant, it is even younger. It's only about 600 years old. The idea that these two peoples have been fighting for thousands of years just doesn't mathematically make any sense. And when people say that, it's the equivalent of just throwing up their hands and saying, yeah, what are you going to do? They hate each other. But a larger and more egregious issue, I think, with characterizing the relationship between these two peoples that way, is that it ignores the centuries of shared history of cooperation and coexistence between people who speak Arabic and people who are Jewish in the Middle East, in North Africa, and for a time even in Europe. Maimonides, one of the most prolific Sephardic Jewish philosophers in that tradition, was born and raised in Almoravid Islamic Andalusia, in what is now southern Spain. The Almoravids themselves were an Amazigh or Berber dynasty, but the population of Al-Andalus was largely either Arabic or Romance speaking. And that society produced one of the greatest thinkers of the Jewish world. There were Jewish people living throughout the Arab world, from Morocco to Iraq, for as long as there has been an Arab world. They lived and coexisted for hundreds of years, eating the same food, speaking the same languages, and participating in each other's traditions. The idea that they are somehow natural enemies ignores all of that history. It also erases completely the identity of Arabic-speaking Jews. Jewish communities who lived in Arabic-speaking countries in the Middle East very often spoke Arabic as their first language, just like Muslim and Christian Arabs. And Arab is an ethno-linguistic identity, not a racial one. There are Arabs with dark brown skin and hair textures that we would consider black in the West. There are olive-skinned and brown-eyed Arabs. There are some Arabs with blonde or even red hair and blue or green eyes. Some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are Druze. The only thing that unifies them is that they speak Arabic. And so if that's the case, then these Arabic-speaking Jewish communities have just as much of a right to that Arab identity. For a variety of reasons, the descendants of those communities in Israel today tend not to use that label to define themselves. They are most often called Mizrahi Jews, which is a Hebrew word that means Eastern, which incidentally does beg the question, East of what? But if you'd like to know more about the history of Mizrahi Jewish identity within Israel and the erasure of Arab Jewish identity that preceded it, I don't have time to get into it in detail in this episode, but I would encourage you to look into the work of Israeli Arab Jewish scholars Avi Shleim and Hadar Cohen, both of whom have written a ton about it and done a bunch of interviews discussing it at length with much more knowledge and much more direct experience than I have. Now look, some of you may be listening to me say that and think that I'm maybe painting an overly rosy picture of the history of Jewish people in the Muslim or Arab world, and I'm glossing over real anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. And it is true that historically, over the course of the hundreds of years that Jews and Arabs have occupied the same geography, where Jewish people have almost always been a demographic minority, there have been real incidences of communal violence. And I'll also acknowledge that for many Jewish people today, whose grandparents or great-grandparents may have been born in Arab countries, that their most recent memories of the relationships between those communities may include discrimination and violence. But I think that it is possible to hold space for both of those realities. Hundreds of years living peacefully side by side doesn't negate the very real discrimination that people faced both historically and more recently. But at the same time, those incidences of discrimination are dwarfed by the hundreds of years of peaceful coexistence, largely without incident. We are talking about a period of centuries. Yes, at times violence broke out and Jewish people were among the targets of that violence. But it is still clearly ahistorical to say that these two communities have always been at odds with each other, particularly when you consider the treatment of Jewish people in Europe. Middle Eastern Jews were much more integrated into their communities than European Jews, and Jewish people in Europe were inarguably subject to greater legal restrictions, more restricted freedom of movement, and more frequent and more severe communal violence than their counterparts in the Arab world. But nobody today would ever talk about the global Jewish community being inherently at odds with European Christendom in a feud going back 1,000 years, even though that is a much more historically accurate way to describe that relationship than the one between Jewish people and Arabs. The second equally unproductive, but ultimately even more harmful framing of this conflict is through the lens of Israeli control of American power. Critics of Zionism, particularly I think ones who are new to learning about and discussing the history of this conflict, those who were maybe peripherally aware of what was happening in Palestine before last year, but who really began to pay attention in a serious way after October 7th, 2023, have a tendency to invoke this idea that rather than being a client state of the United States, Israel controls the world's superpower and its leaders effectively dictate policy in Washington. And to an extent, they can be forgiven for thinking that, given that they watched former president and current war criminal Joe Biden and every genocide-enabling representative of his government stand on stage every day for an entire year and effectively say, we are very concerned that our friend and ally is perpetrating a genocide, but not concerned enough to do anything about it. And not only that, but you have no right to be upset about it. We will criminalize your lawful speech, slander you, and use state violence against you, because you should be grateful that we have sent this series of strongly worded letters expressing our deep displeasure and informing the genocidaires that we're not mad, we're just disappointed in every shipment of bombs and weaponry we sent them, using the money that we could be using to pay for your schools and give you health care. This is further reinforced by the existence of AIPAC, who openly brag about getting American politicians that are even mildly critical of Israeli policy primaried out of their districts or otherwise sidelined. I understand why this framing is a tempting framing to adopt. Over the last year, the behavior of the American government has led many people, including myself at times, to wonder who the actual hegemon is here. And how could it be America if it is apparently so powerless to rein in its own client state when its client state is engaged in activity that so pains the tender little hearts of its leaders? But there are two issues with this framing. One is that it is objectively untrue, and the second is that because it's untrue, it is anti-Semitic. And because it's anti-Semitic, it allows people to dismiss any critique of Israel's actions that may precede or follow it as anti-Semitic as well. The reason that it's anti-Semitic is that a well-known anti-Semitic trope is the cabal of Jewish people that are simultaneously powerless and omnipotent, who are incapable of direct control of the world the way that like a hegemonic power might exert that control through force, and so must instead resort to more underhanded forms of control through things like control of the banking industry or of the media, or in this case, political lobbying organizations, in order to advance some nefarious Jewish agenda. And while I want to be extremely clear that Israel is not and does not represent Jewish people writ large, the Israeli government would have you believe that they do. They are actively and deeply invested in the conflation of the state of Israel and its policies with the idea of Jewishness itself. They promote that incessantly in nearly every official communication they make, and this is why. This anti-Semitic trope has been used throughout European history to demonize and other Jewish people and identify them as targets of violence and harassment. But an element of that demonization that I think often goes overlooked in discussions about anti-Semitism, and I think is particularly relevant in this case, is who this trope actually serves and to what end it has been deployed historically. And I think if you examine it from that lens, it reveals pretty quickly why it's deployed so often in this case. Who benefits from identifying Jewish people, or in this framing, Israel, as a shadowy cabal secretly controlling everything behind the scenes? The answer to that is the people who actually have the power. This is a trope that's historically been deployed by the powerful to scapegoat Jewish people and direct the anger of the people about things that they might have rightfully identified as real issues, whether it's their own suffering under feudalism and poor material conditions in medieval Europe, or in this case, the suffering of the Palestinian people and the actions of the Israeli government today, away from where it belongs, which is directed at the actual people, the specific individuals who hold the power to address those issues. And while, yes, some of those people are in the Israeli government, I want to be very clear that I am not absolving the Israeli government or the Israeli state of moral responsibility for its treatment of the Palestinian people today or historically. Not the genocide, not the apartheid, and not the colonial violence that it has visited on them since its inception. But the idea that Israel manipulated the United States into its support for those things, and that the Israeli state, government, or people is really the puppet master pulling the US's strings, is an example of this anti-Semitic trope, because it's not true, and getting people to believe it serves the interests of the US government. Not only can supporters of the Israeli state now rightfully point out that critics of Israel are engaged in this anti-Semitic trope, it also absolves the US government, and by the way, all the governments of the Western world, including Canada, including Western Europe, of their complicity and support and equal share of moral responsibility for the Israeli government's treatment of the Palestinian people. Because while it is true that there is an Israeli lobby that has maybe an outsized influence in the politics of the Western world, it is not the only lobby. It's not even the only foreign lobby. The reality is that without the financial, political, and military support of Western nations, Israel not only could not enact the violence that it has on the Palestinian population it has occupied for the last 3/4 of a century, it could not exist at all. And the reason this support is offered, and by extension, the reason that even the Israeli lobby exists, is that the existence of the state of Israel serves Western interests, and by extension, Western capital. Since well before its inception, Israel was pitched to Western leaders as a sort of fifth column for their interest in the Middle East in the waning days of the colonial era. Although I think it's an exaggeration to say that early Zionists definitively thought of themselves as colonizers in the traditional European sense, I think the reality, if you read their writing, is more complicated than that. It wasn't as straightforward to say the French with their mission civilisatrice. They didn't exclusively see their mission in Palestine as one of a foreign people burdened with civilizing the savages. There was a genuine view of Palestine as their ancestral indigenous homeland and real political and social reasons why they felt it was necessary for European Jews to migrate there en masse. But at the same time, it's certainly true that they framed it that way in their appeals to Western leaders in order to sway them to support their cause. Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of political Zionism, famously wrote to Cecil Rhodes to ask him for financial and political support for Jewish mass migration to Palestine, and he framed it explicitly in that way. This is a direct quote from the letter that was included in his personal writings. The letter was ultimately unsent, but you can see both aspects of this framing in it directly. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out of the way matter for you? How indeed? Because it is something colonial, and because it presupposes understanding of a development which will take 20 or 30 years. There are visionaries who look past greater spaces in time, but they lack a practical sense. Then again, there are practical people, like the trust magnates in America, but they lack political imagination. But you, Mr. Rhodes, are a visionary politician or a practical visionary. You have already demonstrated this. And what I want you to do is not give me or lend me a few guineas, but to put the stamp of your authority on the Zionist plan and to make the following declaration to a few people who swear by you. I, Rhodes, have examined this plan and found it correct and practicable. It is a plan full of culture, excellent for the group for whom it is directly designed, not detrimental to the general progress of mankind, and quite good for England, for Greater Britain. If you and your associates supply the requested financial aid for this, you will, in addition to these satisfactions, have the satisfaction of making a good profit. For what is being asked for is money. This letter was drafted some 50 years before the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, and it was clear already at the time that although for the Zionists this was to an extent about the welfare of their own people and the necessity, as they saw it, for a Jewish homeland somewhere, they understood already that great Western powers had no interest or care for the welfare of the Jewish people. And so if they were going to convince them to give the Jewish people a state, the quid pro quo needed to be that that state served the national and financial interests of Western capital. And you can see that very clearly in this letter to Rhodes. He references them making profit directly. President Harry Truman, the US president who recognized the state of Israel, is widely said to have done so because of the influence of a Jewish friend of his who was himself a Zionist. There's likely some truth to that. People are often more swayed by their personal opinions and the opinions of friends of theirs than they are by political considerations. But what is also true is that Truman, and certainly his successor Eisenhower, saw the value of Israel as a strategic bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East, because a socialist Middle East could not be allowed to exist. It would threaten Western capital because oil producing nations insisting on owning the means of production of that oil, almost all of which was and still is in the hands of Western capital, would be a threat to those same Western capital interests. In the wake of the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was making significant political inroads in the region, just as the British Empire was effectively collapsing, and the British sphere of influence had shrunk so much during the war that even their direct colonies were declaring their independence left and right. British and French hegemony, which had basically characterized the region and provided the counterbalance to the Russian sphere of influence in the Middle East since the end of World War I and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, had weakened so much that many American leaders were seeing the writing on the wall and correctly assessing that these newly independent Arab states, who, under the flag of Arab nationalism, were justifiably hostile to Western influence in their politics, might be amenable to an alliance with the Soviets, and were certainly ideologically aligned with socialist movements. The Ba'athist governments of Iraq and Syria, as well as Nasser in Egypt, were explicitly socialist, at least in name, if not always in policy. And when Israel declared its independence and was attacked by all of the neighboring countries, the United States provided the military aid necessary for them to repel that invasion and establish the state that came to be called Israel. When war broke out again in 1967, it was again America, with the support of Britain and France, providing military aid to Israel in the form of daily and sometimes twice daily shipments of weapons, which allowed them to win that war. And it was American policy to allow them to keep and annex territory which they had won militarily during that conflict. The same was true in the 1973 war, which also could not have been won without material support from the United States. It was also the United States that forced Israel to return some territory that it had captured in these wars. It forced Israel to surrender the Sinai and the West Bank. It later forced them to pull out of directly occupying Gaza in 2004. The US provides Israel with billions of dollars of military aid and has provided them with a missile defense system more sophisticated than any system in use in the United States, and has supported them through every military conflict they have ever been involved in. They use their veto on the UN Security Council to block nearly any resolution sanctioning Israel for the war crimes it commits. As recently as last year, the Israeli government themselves said that without material support from the US, they could not successfully repel an invasion by the surrounding hostile nations. And so, what can't be overlooked when talking about the relationship between the United States and Israel is that Israel needs and relies on America for the impunity that it enjoys. And a country that needs and relies on aid from another has no actual power to force America to do anything. Ronald Reagan stopped Menachem Begin from bombing Beirut with a phone call. Israel is given impunity when and only when it serves Western interests, and Western national interests have historically been one and the same with the interests of Western capital. When the US wants a friendly power to counterbalance the influence of the Soviet Union on the Arab states, when it serves the interests of US capital for those states to be weak so they don't challenge American commercial dominance over the oil sector, Israel is allowed to invade and attack those nations. When some of those nations, like Jordan and Egypt, reject Soviet influence and are subsumed into the sphere of influence of the United States, Israel is forced to return territory to those nations in exchange for normalized relations. The idea that Israel is somehow manipulating the United States into supporting it is not only ahistorical, it also absolves the United States of its shared responsibility for all the death, destruction, war crimes, and genocide perpetrated by Israel. Because the reality is that Israel would have been unable to exist, let alone carry out ethnic cleansing and genocide, without the support of the United States and its allies. And that makes the United States and those allies as responsible for the consequences of Israel's actions as Israel itself. And on a level, I think we know this. It is why this conflict occupies such an outsized space in our Western political discourse. We are aware on some level that we fund and are complicit in the actions of the Israeli state. And we are aware as citizens in Western countries that our governments have the power to put a stop to it. And so while we might be horrified by China's treatment of the Uyghurs within its own borders, China is not our client state. And the only tools that we have to put a stop to that genocide are rhetorical. The very existence of this discourse is evidence of our own complicity, because we wouldn't be on TV pontificating about what should and shouldn't happen in a country where we don't feel like our government has a direct impact on the outcome. So, what does this mean for today? And what does it mean in the context of what should be done in the future? What should we be advocating for as leftists in the West? And what outcome should we be hoping for here? My opinion is that we should be extremely skeptical of any solution proposed by the United States, because Western capital, the real shadowy cabal that pulls the strings behind the US government, will never allow a solution to be proposed that actually challenges its power or US hegemony. A two-state solution, which is a solution created by Americans and supported by most Western powers, is at best a stopgap solution that kicks the can of this conflict down the line a few decades, and at worst, and by at worst, I mean in the form it has always been presented, is an effective continuation of the status quo in all but name. Zionists, American and Israeli, most notably Bill Clinton himself, when discussing the genocide in Gaza last year, frequently invoked the idea that the Palestinians were already offered a state during the Clinton presidency, and they turned it down, with the horrific implication that that refusal by Yasser Arafat of the Clinton-drafted partition plan and the Oslo Accords makes the Palestinian people responsible in perpetuity for any violence Israel has inflicted or will inflict on them since 1998, without ever mentioning that that plan would not have created two equal states with equal sovereignty and would have given Israel security concessions. The Palestinian state proposed would not have been allowed to have a military and would have had to submit to Israeli military oversight. That is effectively the status quo. The problem with the two-state solution has always been and will always be that one of those two states would still be Israel. And Israel has already shown itself to be completely uninterested and incapable of abiding by any international agreement, or even entertaining the idea that Palestinian people have any true sovereignty anywhere. In my opinion, there is only one tenable solution here, and that is a one-state solution, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And on that, Zionists and I almost agree, except for the part where their plan is for that state to just be Israel and to have as few Palestinian Arabs as possible in it. Their plan from the beginning was to drive the Palestinian Arabs out into the neighboring countries. David Ben-Gurion, the first leader of Israel, said as much in his private writing. Many supporters of Israel today frequently say that Arabs have some 20 states. Why is it wrong for Jewish people to have just one? Does Israel not have a right to exist? And I'll address both of those points separately. Firstly, while there are around 20 Arab states, Arabs are not all the same. They happen to share a language, although if you're at all interested in linguistics, you may know that the line between a dialect and a language is often quite blurry, and the difference between Moroccan Arabic and Iraqi Arabic is not all that much smaller than the difference between Spanish and Italian. But we would not accept the expulsion of all Spanish speakers in Catalonia to Italy and Portugal in order to carve out a state for the Catalan, just because they happen to share a similar language and culture. Palestinian Arabs are distinct from Lebanese and Syrian and Jordanian and Egyptian Arabs. They have their own culture, their own dialect, their own cuisine, and their own traditions. And to say, oh, they're all Arabs, why can't they go to one of the other Arab countries, ignores all of that. The second question is more tricky, but in my mind, the answer is still no. Israel does not have a right to exist. No state has a right to exist. States do not have rights. People have rights. And a right that I do not believe that any people have, not Jewish people, not Palestinian Arabs, not Turks or Kurds, not the French, not the Japanese, is the right to an ethno-state. I am a citizen and a product of a pluralistic secular democracy, and I live in one for a reason. That is a mode of government that I believe in. I believe that states should reflect and respect the identities of all of the people who live there without privileging any one ethnic or racial or religious group above the others. The degree to which the one that I live in actually does that is up for debate, but I believe in the principle of that. That is the only kind of state that I think should exist anywhere. And it's the only one that's compatible with my values as a leftist, as a secular mixed race person, as a human being. So no, I don't believe there should be a Jewish state. You're free to call that anti-Semitic if you want, but you should know that that is not a belief I hold only about a Jewish state. It's a belief that I hold about states. Ethno-states are morally wrong because people do not live within clearly defined borders. The world is and has always been mixed up. Every nation was multi-ethnic before ethno-nationalism as an ideology necessitated homogenous ethnic populations. Ethno-states are impossible without ethnic cleansing, and I, for one, am against ethnic cleansing. So when I say a one-state solution, what I am talking about is a solution where everyone who currently lives in that territory, Jewish or Arab, is allowed to live and practice their culture, their religion, speak their language, make and eat their food, play their music, and generally have their rights and their identity respected in a community as equals. They have equal political representation, equal rights and protection under the law, and equal say in the domestic and foreign policy of the land in which they live. And I understand why that idea is scary to people, particularly, I think, to Israelis. That is a nice idea to support in theory, but in practice, I think it is normal for people on both sides to view that as being effectively trapped in a cage with people that they think want them dead. And I acknowledge that, particularly given the events of the last year, it may seem like an impossible task to even get people to entertain the idea of peacefully coexisting in one state. That may be a goal that's decades away. It may require a two-state solution as an interim before arriving ultimately at one state that respects everyone's rights and allows the right of return. But the reason that I feel like a one-state solution is the only solution is the same reason that I believe what I said at the beginning of this segment. That ultimately, historical context is useful for understanding how we arrived at the present situation. And it will be useful for understanding and analyzing where to assign responsibility and who needs to be held accountable for what. But it's not necessary to know what needs to happen going forward. Because what I'm about to say are truths, and they are truths that only allow us to arrive at a few possible outcomes. The first truth is that it is a crime against humanity to forcibly displace any population. It's morally unacceptable to exile any group of people from the place where they currently live. The second truth is that it is equally a crime against humanity to exterminate any population. This should be obvious, but as a global community, we should not allow any community to exterminate another community. And the third truth is that both of these truths apply equally to Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. Palestinian Arabs are not going anywhere. There are millions of them, and they have a right to live where they want within their ancestral lands. Likewise, the Jewish people who currently live in Israel are also not going anywhere. And it would be a crime against humanity to force them to leave. Frankly, debating the indigeneity of either people at this point is irrelevant. These are actual people who actually live somewhere. They are there right now, and it would require violence on a monstrous scale, a tremendous historical crime, to force either group to not be where they are right now. Which leaves the people who currently live in what I will call Palestine two options. One people can exterminate or expel the other, which again would be a horrific crime that we as observers in the civilized world should not allow, and should do everything within our power to prevent. Or they can eventually learn to coexist and form a society that respects the rights of both peoples to live where they want to live. Ultimately, they are going to have to live and work together. I'm not saying that will be an easy process. Coexistence and mutual respect is much more difficult than violence. It requires trust, and trust is the hardest thing humans can do. I also don't want to ignore the fact that for any of that to happen, there must first be accountability for the near century of oppression, apartheid, and genocide that Israel has visited on the Palestinian people. We talk enough in the West about holding Palestinians accountable for the crimes that they commit, but rarely, if ever, about accountability for the perpetrators of the structural violence inflicted by the Israeli state on a captive, colonized population. It is all well and good to talk about a bright future where these two people can stand together as one and build a great society that has a lot to offer the world. I believe in that vision. I believe in that possibility. And I believe that you don't need to understand 75 years of the minutia of partition plans and negotiations and who agreed to what to know that that would be the best outcome for all of the people involved. But I don't believe in ignoring that history. I believe in accountability. And really, those two missions are one and the same because those that need to be held accountable in Israel, in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe are the same people who would stand in the way of a project that brought real sovereignty and real self-determination and mutual respect to everyone who lives in Palestine. I had originally planned for this segment to be much longer and to get much deeper into the minutiae of Israeli war crimes in Gaza over the past year, and more broadly, the scope of colonial oppression in Palestine over the past 75 years, so that we can start to parse that accountability for ourselves. But I thought that my voice and my platform and my education was better used to provide some historical context and some more structural analysis, and to talk about the ways in which we in the West are directly complicit and directly involved in that oppression. And I actually think that it would be much more useful for you to hear about Palestinian experiences from Palestinians directly. So, if you're interested, I would encourage you to look into the work of Palestinian journalists and artists who have been documenting what has been happening over the last year. Mossab Abu Toha, Bisan Auda, Mohammed Kurd, and Motaz Azeza. I hope I pronounced those names even close to correctly. I'm not Arab and I don't speak Arabic, but those are good places to start if you're looking for information specifically about the last year or the last couple of years. And if you're looking for things to read more broadly about the history of Palestine and Israel, I'd again recommend the works of Avi Shleim, also of Rashid Khalidi, of Ilan Pape, and of Norm Finkelstein. Those are all scholars that have done good work in that area. But what I will say now to close off on this idea is that there are unquestionably members of the Israeli government, both current and former, and the IDF, both current and former, who are guilty of war crimes and genocide. There are members of the American government, the Canadian government, and the governments of Europe who are equally guilty of complicity in and support for genocide. But for the kind of state that I'm talking about, and the vision for the future that I hope to see take shape in my lifetime to exist, these people need to be held accountable for those crimes. We cannot ask the people of Palestine to live alongside their former oppressors without that accountability. But once those people have been held to account, there needs to be a way forward for everyone who lives in that territory. Because whether we like it or not, whether it's fair or not, nobody is going anywhere. I'm going to close out this week with yet another poem. I again did not plan to do a poem this week, but I came across this one in my research for this episode, and I think it ties in nicely to some of the stuff that I've been talking about. It's a poem from 2012 called I Am You by the late great Gazan poet Rafat Al-Arir, who was tragically killed alongside his elder daughter and newborn grandchild on December 6th of 2023 by an Israeli airstrike on their home. I Am You by Rafat Al-Arir. 2 steps. 1, 2. Look in the mirror. The horror. The horror. The butt of your M16 on my cheekbone. The yellow patch it left. The bullet-shaped scar expanding like a swastika, snaking across my face. The heartache flowing. Out of my eyes dripping. Out of my nostrils piercing. My ears flooding the place, like it did to you 70 years ago or so. I am just you. I am your past haunting, your present and your future. I strive like you did. I fight like you did. I resist like you resisted. And for a moment, I'd take your tenacity as a model were you not holding the barrel of the gun between my bleeding eyes. 1, 2. The very same gun. The very same bullet that killed your mom and killed your dad is being used against me by you. Mark this bullet and mark in your gun. If you sniff it, it has your and my blood. It has my present and your past. It has my present. It has your future. That's why we are twins. Same life track, same weapon, same suffering, same facial expressions drawn on the face of the killer. Same everything. Except that in your case, the victim has evolved backward into a victimizer. I tell you, I am you. Except that I am not the you of now. I do not hate you. I want to help you stop hating and killing me. I tell you, the noise of your machine gun renders you deaf. The smell of the powder beats that of my blood. The sparks disfigure my facial expressions. Would you stop shooting for a moment? Would you? All you have to do is close your eyes. Seeing these days blinds our hearts. Close your eyes tightly so that you can see in your mind's eye. Then look in the mirror. 1, 2. I am you. I am your past. And killing me, you kill you. That's it for me this week. As always, thank you for listening. If you made it this far and you liked what you heard, please give us 5 stars or a like and subscribe. Please share it with your friends. I'd like to thank you all for waiting patiently while I got this one done this week. I was waylaid a bit by the current snowpocalypse we are living through here in Toronto, but we should be back next Sunday with a different topic on our regular release schedule. I'd like to give our weekly thank you to Suz Jazz Paris for allowing us to use his music. And I'd finally like to say that if you are in Palestine or you are Palestinian in diaspora, I wish you and your community peace and safety and freedom and justice. I hope you feel like I've spoken about this issue with the sensitivity and the accuracy that it deserves. Until next week, I've been Andrew, and you've been listening to the Bad Eye Podcast. Free Palestine.